Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on this wonderful Wednesday afternoon here. And for our midweek show, happy hump day to you all out there. To get over that respective hump with today's show, we're going to be doing all things Thursday Night Football. I always like to get ahead of the curve in that regard. Doing a general betting preview, getting you prepped on all the money lines, over-unders, and things of that nature for tomorrow night. And looking at some general prop bets on what should be a feisty NFC encounter, concluding our positional rankings as well with our tight ends and our defense and special teams units that I believe will perform very well in this coming week. And to conclude today's show, we are going to be looking a little bit at college football. Week 9 will kick off on Saturday. A lot of interesting games, actually Friday. Scratch that from what I said before. Friday, we will have Boise State UNLV, which will be a good one. Kind of giving you a hint of what's to come in that segment. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you that if you feel so inclined, to consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show on the network to further support it. It's a great way if you want to interact with more shows, see what other podcasts we have here on the network. It is highly appreciated in advance in whatever capacity you choose to interact with the show. But one way to do it more directly, including through our live streams, and making yourselves available to here on YouTube, the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features. They're the best ways to get your comments and opinions on air. You can either just leave any burning questions, comments, or concerns you have throughout the show, or also click that $sign right there in the comments section to leave a tip or donation. But all you do for this show is greatly appreciated because it only makes it that much better. Without further ado, let's jump to our first segment of the day, our Thursday Night Football betting preview. Now, this game between the Vikings and the Rams is a very interesting one. The Vikings coming off their first loss of the season at home to the divisional rival Detroit Lions, going on the road to SoFi Stadium to face a very gritty Rams team, pulling a very gritty victory over Las Vegas last week. And this certainly feels like one of those games that could be a trap game for a team like Minnesota, who wasn't expecting to be at this point where they are one of the teams to watch in the NFC North in the entire NFC as a true contender, but they also didn't expect to be playing with this much house money at this point in the season. So it's one of those weird games where anything could happen. We could see a sluggish game yet again from Minnesota, or we can just see an utterly dominant performance by Minnesota. On the Rams side of things, this is a weird game for them because of the fact it's coming at least a little bit before the return of some of their weapons, including Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, most importantly. And also, maybe Cooper Kupp will not return to this team in any capacity because of the trade rumors. Apparently, the Chiefs, before acquiring DeAndre Hopkins, tried to trade for Cooper Kupp, and apparently they did not have the resources or didn't make the good enough offer to the Rams to acquire him. But that's something to note going forward for this Rams team. But it's a very interesting game surrounding all that tension and drama off the field. But on the field, I feel like what the Rams can do to slow down the Vikings is that, A, play into the home crowd atmosphere, even though SoFi is not necessarily known for its crowd atmosphere, so to speak. But also rely on your physicality. That's what I feel like the Rams have done in the absence of players like Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. They relied on their physicality. They've done just enough to get themselves over the edge in some games, like last week, like in that game against the 49ers. So, this one can be close, but I still feel like at the end of the day I'm going to have to lean towards the Vikings here. But in terms of a general betting perspective, Minnesota are actually 3-point road favorites. The over-under is a respectable 46.5. LA is a plus 140 to win. Minnesota at minus 165. So as you can see, not much discrepancy here, but I do feel like it's telling that Minnesota is a road favorite, however small that total seems, in my opinion. But going into this game and looking at it from a neutral perspective, this is one of those games that feels like a turning point for each respective team should they win or lose. For the Vikings, if they win, it's just another win in the win column for them, I feel like. They feel like they knew they weren't going to go 17-0, but they're working with what they got. And they understand their identity, and it translates into how they play. Their physical style on defense, their complementary style on offense. And thus, that's why I feel like this could be a game where we see them return to form. On the other side, if they lose this game, how much concern would, say, a Vikings fan have if you lose 2 straight? Because of the fact that, yes, you have a divisional loss already, but you still haven't played the majority of your divisional games. And looking at it from that perspective, I feel like either way, Minnesota wouldn't feel that terribly. Because losing this game, yes, you're kind of in a bit of a slump if you do so, but you still have an opportunity to go out, win your divisional games, and take care of business in that regard. So if you lose this game, it's no sweat off your back. You're still in an advantageous position. You're still one of the top teams in the NFC. And all you really want to worry about is staying in the playoff picture. So one meaningless loss, albeit in a presumable trap game, doesn't necessarily mean the end of the season, as my man Andre enters the chat. Now, on the Rams side of things, if they win, that is huge for them, especially considering the tenor of the NFC West, because the NFC West is a winnable division right now. No one has truly separated themselves. So if the Rams win this game, they will be sitting at 4-4. Seattle has a tough game at home against the Bills. The 49ers have a weird game against the Cowboys, and who knows what the Cardinals will look like going forward. So if the Rams win this game without Kupp and Nakua, that is very integral to their playoff push going forward. They are a little bit of a wild card in this division and in the NFC, but they can use that to their advantage, much like they did last year when no one really expected them to make that little playoff push. If they lose this game, I kind of feel like the Kupp trade rumors will come circling. And not for nothing, I do feel like more teams will be offloading receivers than adding them to their team. But I do feel like Kupp would be an interesting piece for, say, a contender. Maybe not a contender in the NFC West, because there's no way the Rams want to trade within the division, especially to teams like the Niners and the Seahawks, who might be wanting to make that playoff push at the end of the year. But certainly to potentially a team that feels like they're in the mix. I feel like the Chiefs are kind of set with what they did, but say, a mid-tier AFC team, maybe, the Broncos or the Steelers would be someone who could come calling. Maybe even the Jets, if they're dissatisfied with their receiving core, they trade away Mike Williams but still want to bring in someone else. It's a crazy, far-fetched idea, but the idea will be more entertained should the Rams lose this one. But ultimately, what it comes down to is how weird this game is for both teams at this juncture in the season. Because no one expected the Vikings to be where they're at. And no one expected that if they lost this game, it wouldn't necessarily mean anything. Not because they had a losing record, but because they had a winning record. And for the Rams side of things, no one truly expected them to, have to handle so much injury problems, yet still be in the NFC West race due to the fact that other teams in the NFC West have injury concerns of their own. So that's what makes this game so puzzling to bet on, because it feels so easy to hedge your bets on the Vikings because of the fact they feel like the superior team, they feel like the more complete team. But you have to think, this is a weird situation after an emotional home loss, their first of the season, after an unprecedented start for them. Going on the road to SoFi, yes, it's not the best of home field advantages for teams that play there, but it's still a significant journey for the Vikings to make. Going up against a gritty, physical Rams team without their best weapons, that's kind of pissed off to begin with, to potentially supplant some teams in the NFC West, plus add back your injured weapons to your squad, should both of them remain on this team, then that's where all the questions can arise. I'm still picking the Vikings, and I think they will cover this spread, but I'm not sure, as Ani said, I actually wouldn't be so shocked if the Rams won, and I wouldn't be shocked either. I feel like this game is so bizarre, as Ani said, McVay is also going to dial something up. Yes, I feel like McVay will have a big say in this game as well, because he's really utilized certain players to the best of their abilities. But I also feel like the reason why this game is so much in the Rams' court is because this is one of those teams that feels like, they're not going to be in the playoff conversation. They aren't thus far, but in all reality, due to the volatility of the NFC, especially the NFC West, this is their opportunity. And they're getting a Vikings team who might be resting on its laurels a little bit and might be letting their guards down in this game after a practically cross-country trip. So that's why I feel it's a weird game. I still am going to take the Vikings just because I think they're the better team, and I can't deny that defense can stifle and is proven they can stifle McVay-style offenses this season. But I am kind of interested to see how the Rams play this, because they have the advantage in terms of the home field and in terms of where the Vikings could be at mentally in this game. Let me know what you think about this game in the comments, because we are going to, right after this short break, continue talking about this game in terms of a prop bets perspective. A couple popular ones out there as well. So we'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you that throughout the show, if you do feel so inclined, continue to make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. They're a great way, the best way, to interact with the show in a more direct fashion, to get your opinions out there, any questions, comments, or concerns you may have. They are greatly appreciated by all concerned here at the network, as Hunter18 enters the chat. Hello to you, my friend. How are you doing? But it just makes the show that much better, hearing from you guys throughout. We love your support of our shows and our network here, so thank you in advance. But without further ado, let us get into our second segment here of the show. Continuing with the Thursday Night Football narrative, as Hunter says, mind if I ask a couple questions? Of course, my man. Fire away, and we will wait for you in that regard. We're going to continue, though, with our Thursday Night Football prop bets. Starting off with the quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings before Hunter 18 gets his comments in real quickly. I think that Sam Darnold is one of those quarterbacks you can't really gauge from a betting perspective just because of how volatile this Vikings offense can prove to be. They do seem to feel like they have an interesting balance between what Sam Darnold can do through the air and what Aaron Jones can do on the ground. So that's why I'm a little apprehensive about talking about Sam Darnold prop bets, but I do think that this one looks the most intriguing. I'm going to say he hits the under. His under is at 238.5 yards, and I know it's a little bit of a low bar. As Ty Johnson says, you got any college bets for tonight? I don't think that any games are going on tonight, but thank you for the comment, Ty Johnson. I will check the college football schedules, but I do believe that Boise State and UNLV kick off tomorrow, and I will be talking about that later in the show, so stay tuned for that. But Hunter18 also says, hi, I have 3 picks I'm stuck on. If I post them, could you tell me what you like the most? Fire away, my man. I do have them at the end of the show as well, so if you have any questions about any of the bets I have myself prepared, then you can fire away as well, but hit me for anything. And then Hunter18 says Cade Otton versus Atlanta for this week, or Hunter Henry versus the Jets in a PPR league. I actually think that Cade Otton is a very interesting tight end that doesn't get the credit he deserves. And I think in this matchup against Atlanta, where, Atlanta's defense did get exposed by the Seattle Seahawks, I feel that tight end heavy teams, especially now that Tampa Bay will have to rely on a guy like Otton, can affect that Atlanta Falcons zone heavy scheme. So I would say Cade Otton would be my pick, surprisingly. Whereas Hunter Henry, I feel like it just depends on the target share in that Patriots offense. Now that you have Drake May, yes, the targets will go up, but I'm not certain that Hunter Henry will always be the guy. So I'm actually taking Cade Otton. I know it's an unusual, unconventional pick from me, but I actually think it profiles the best in this matchup. So hopefully that helps. And Ty, if you're still there and you want to talk a little bit more about college football before I get into my segment, then fire away. But getting back to Sam Darnold, I do think the under for him will be the best way to bet on him tomorrow because of the volatility of that Vikings offense. Then Justin Jefferson, I think that he himself will hit the over, though, because of the fact that he can always impact a game on short notice, no matter what is going on in it. Because of the fact that you never know how the Vikings will look in certain quarters, whether they'll be ahead, whether they'll be behind. And, if they fall behind in this game, which I do think they might just do, I feel like Justin Jefferson will be the reason they can climb back into it. So look for, Sam Darnold to kind of quote-unquote pad his stats later in the game, leading to me believing that he won't necessarily hit the over, but having Justin Jefferson garner just enough yards to hit that over in that respect. He's definitely someone who can exploit defenses later in games because you feel like you have the Vikings offense corralled at certain points, and then you have to worry about Justin Jefferson going off on your tired defense. So who knows? I feel like this feels like the safest bet of any skill position player on the Vikings just because he's Justin Jefferson, and you have to account for how good he is and how important his standing is really in this Vikings offense, no matter how it looks day to day and week to week. But that's the safest bet, in my opinion, for the Vikings here. The two safest, rather, for the Vikings in this game. On the Rams side of things, I feel like they're going to play it safe a little bit. I will address your comment, but I do want to get to the Rams a little bit before that. Hunter 18, but I thank you for your comment and your patience. I do feel like the Rams here are going to keep it simple. They're not, going to try to completely overwhelm them with, what McVay can do on the offensive side of the football. But I do feel that they know their identity. They know their culture without and with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. And for the time being, potentially the last game, they will have to play this way. They're going to do ground and pound attack. Thus, I feel like Matthew Stafford will hit the over just because I feel like the Rams can get a lot of yards after the catch for him. But I do feel like that one's a little bit of a tenuous one. Over 235.5 yards. I do think that's a fine enough total for Matthew Stafford at this point in the season, but I do feel it's dependent on guys like Atwell extending the play and, things of that nature. So I do think that the Rams' passing attack right now is something that you can't necessarily ignore, but it is something that is going to be heavily reliant on the receivers themselves, not necessarily anything Matthew Stafford will have to do out of the ordinary. And then in terms of the running game, this is where I feel like the Rams will really lean on a guy like Kyren Williams. So Andre, if you're still there, I don't necessarily feel like you should bench Kyren in this game. Going back to that comment, I promise, Hunter 18, I will get to your comment. This is the last prop bet I want to get to for tomorrow night. Kyren Williams, then, I do think he will hit the over as well. He's been playing pretty well over the past 3 weeks especially, and I do feel like he's someone who week in, week out feels like he should have some down games, but the consistency of what he can do in the Rams offense and how he sets up what McVay can do to really stretch defenses is his physicality. And I can't ignore that in a game against such an aggressive defense where you might need the presence of a running back like Williams to settle your offense down, especially with what McVay thinks he might be able to do against this Brian Flores defense. So Kyren Williams over 74.5 yards. Look for him to also be a potent option in the receiving game as well. Like I said, a lot of the Rams' yards will have to be accounted for after the catch. So look for Kyren Williams to be someone who can potentially do that. But those are all the prop bets that I do have for tomorrow night's game. It's just a question of, which team feels more ready, looks more ready, prepares better for this game. That will lead us into, before we get into our next break, Hunter 18's comment here about his fantasy team yet again. He needs 2 running backs, a wide receiver, and a flex option out of these players. Brian Thomas, David Montgomery, DeAndre Swift, Devon Achane, Alexander Madison, Jalen Waddle, Deontay Johnson, or even McMillan in a PPR setting. I feel like this is an interesting group of players here just because they're not necessarily players who you would expect to week in, week out perform over expectations. There are some guys on there like Achane and Waddle who have underperformed this season, but it's a group that gives you leeway to really kind of find certain matchups that you like. For example, this week, maybe Brian Thomas's matchup against the Eagles isn't necessarily one you would pinpoint as favorable for him, but it's one that I feel like, considering what the Jags have done with him this season, could be a chance to really see him shine. And then guys like Montgomery and Swift, who are your better of your 4 running backs here, are 2 guys that, have had their struggles so far this season, but their best has really been that good. Montgomery, of course, in a very tough matchup where the Lions might run the football more than usual, and Swift in a matchup against the Cardinals defense that really prides itself on wanting to stop the run first and foremost, and did a great job of stopping J.K. Dobbins this past week. So I think that in terms of matchups, I would say Montgomery is the better of those two running backs especially, and then that leaves Achane and Madison as we are RB2. I think Achane will have a good game, but it's contingent on Tua playing and how he looks coming back from this concussion, because who knows? Maybe, Tua will not look the same or play the same in this McDaniel offense, and he might want to consider handing the ball off more often than not, thus leading to more touches for Devon Achane. So I feel like your two running backs should be Montgomery and Achane here. Your wide receiver, I feel like, while it's been such a disappointment, Deontay Johnson, there's just so many rumors about him potentially leaving Carolina. And McMillan, I love, but maybe not in this situation where it's such a highly tense rematch against the Falcons. So I'm going to begrudgingly say Deontay Johnson is going to be your wide receiver. But then your flex could be someone like a Brian Thomas or a Swift here, because I really don't see Waddle impact this game with or without Tua. And not for nothing, Brian Thomas is bringing out the best in Trevor Lawrence, and they want to work with that connection. And Swift, after a bye week, now more than ever, can prove that those last 3 weeks he just had in fantasy were not a fluke. So those are my options. At flex, either Thomas or Swift, your wide receiver being Deontay Johnson, and your two running backs being Montgomery and Achane. Hopefully that helps for you, my man. Thank you for your comments. We do have to take a quick break here. Coming back on the other side, we kind of conclude our positional rankings with our tight ends before we get into our defense and special teams units, but it should be a good segment nonetheless. We'll be right back to talk about them after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone, and welcome back in to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and we are continuing to look into our positional rankings. This is our second to last one of the week with our tight ends. Now, the tight ends this season have been in some ways underwhelming, in others a little bit so-so. They haven't necessarily been as good a position as I thought they would be, or as many people in fantasy football circles thought they would be, but they still hold merit in terms of matchups. And this week, I feel like nothing screams matchup more than these four tight ends. I feel like as the season goes along, more and more of your decisions based on tight ends will come down to matchups. So hopefully these segments are what separate you, decide between one guy who you feel like is the superstar of your team, or a guy who just feels like in his respective matchup could be a guy that you want to utilize often in terms of his style of play. So without further ado, let's jump right into our fantasy rankings. And this guy played Monday night, actually had, I believe, his best game of the season against LA, and is someone who I really think that in the second half of the season, as he continues to develop his rapport with Kyler Murray, will develop into a guy who's ready to become one of the premier tight ends in football, and that is Trey McBride. He had 10.1 fantasy points versus LA. Not necessarily, you say, the top tier of fantasy production from a tight end, but still better than what he had been in terms of output to start the season. And in this matchup against Miami, I feel like he's going to be someone to exploit their lack of linebacker depth. Obviously, they have a couple injury concerns in there with Jalen Phillips potentially missing. I do believe missing yet again another full season for him. We wish him the best because I love seeing that. But that lack of linebacker depth is what stands out to me in this matchup for Trey McBride. He's going to be able to find more soft spots, really help Kyler Murray underneath, and potentially open up the vertical passing game for him to stretch the field, to kind of create that tension in the Dolphins secondary, which still is one of the better ones in the league, but haven't necessarily faced an offense much like what the Cardinals can be at their best. And I do think in this game the Cardinals will be at their best. We saw glimpses of what their best looked like against LA. We saw the difference that players like Kyler Murray, Trey McBride, and Marvin Harrison can be. It's just a matter of having it all click any given Sunday. And on this Sunday against the Dolphins, I do believe it will all click, especially with Trey McBride in a vault. So Splasher says, who do you have on Thursday? Money line Vikings minus 150 and the Rams plus 130. I did say that I had the Vikings kind of begrudgingly in this game because it's a weird one. I just think that they're the more complete team. Brian Flores' defense feels like the more complete unit, and thus I feel like win or lose, the Vikings will have no sweat off their backs in this one. But getting back into the tight ends here, my second one that I want to kind of cover was just on a bye, and who I'm still really waiting for to break out. But in this weirdly intriguing NFC matchup, feels like someone who's ready to take that next step for an offense that really needs it at this point in their season. Jake Ferguson going up against the 49ers, like I said, coming off the bye. So you never really know with players coming off the bye, especially, tight ends who, like I said, haven't really factored into their team's offense that much. But this certainly feels like a game where the Cowboys need to explore other options outside of forcing certain things, so to speak. I've said my spiel and rant on the Cowboys countless times in this so I'm just going to leave it at needing to incorporate different elements, different nuances to this offense and not, go into specifics, because I don't necessarily think it's the fault of certain players. It's more the fault of the corner the organization has backed certain players into, what with the pressures of how they need to deliver going forward. And so, if guys like Jake Ferguson, guys potentially like Jalen Tolbert, potentially, Rico Dowdle in certain capacities, can be incorporated, integrated into this offense in a meaningful manner, then the Cowboys could have something. And in this game against the 49ers, the 49ers, not necessarily a team with a full bill of health themselves. You really need to find different ways to open up your attacks. We've seen what it could potentially look like. Some guys have stepped up, but I want to see an all-out effort from everyone concerned in this offense, and it starts with Jake Ferguson, because Jake Ferguson can be a problem, especially like I said early in the season in the red zone. And so I want to see more opportunities and more touches for him in certain moments in this game on Sunday. But going to our third tight end of the week, this guy has kind of been one of those guys who you should feel is still going to have one of the better fantasy tight end seasons this year, but just doesn't necessarily have as much influence on this offense as I initially thought. And that is Dalton Kincaid going up against a Seattle team that should be coming off a high, going on the road, and utterly dominating that Falcons offense. But in this matchup, I feel like the Bills' passing attack needs to stay true to what it feels like it was trying to do earlier in the season, right? By simplifying things. I love the addition of Amari Cooper now that I've seen him integrated into this offense, but I do feel like the best way to keep everyone satisfied is to really get back to this offensive roots, which is Josh Allen protecting the football with simplified passes. And Dalton Kincaid was a big part of that, and that's the reason why I feel like against a Seattle team who has proven to be soft at the linebacker position, a little bit weak in terms of their depth there, although they did just sign Ernest Jones. Maybe he can be a helping hand in that department. I just feel like Dalton Kincaid is someone who can exploit the short to intermediate areas of the field for Josh Allen to operate with. And so, even though, it certainly feels like the Bills' passing attack might pretend to go back to that verticality that we saw in the Stephon Diggs era and potentially even earlier in Josh Allen's career, I do want to see, a guy like Dalton Kincaid still have a big impact in this game as well. But that's just my interpretation of this. It could be that, on the road, the Bills' offense kind of stagnates because on the road, Josh Allen has not necessarily looked as much of himself as he has at home, so that could be a huge factor as well. But Dalton Kincaid can be the security blanket in this game for the Bills, and so that's what I want to see out of him this week. And it's more of a matchups-oriented vibe that I'm getting from him rather than, a complete comfortability, even though he is still one of the premier tight ends you think about from a fantasy perspective. But then the last guy that I want to talk about, another Dalton, potentially someone who will not necessarily be as favorable in terms of his whole profile than some of the other guys I've just mentioned. But Dalton Schultz in this matchup against the Colts certainly feels like he can be someone who can get going in this Houston offense. Now, the problem that I feel this Houston offense has is that I don't know what to think of their identity in situational moments. I feel like they want to incorporate more of the running game, and the best parts of their offense this season have stemmed from the running attack. But when they pass the football, I don't necessarily feel like, they know what their intentions are in terms of whether it be in early downs or in third and longs. I don't necessarily know what their kind of scheme is playing out for them. And so I feel like they need more players, especially those who are more comfortable in their respective offenses, as Uma Pesawak Walker 12367 says. I'm interested in what I'm talking about. I am talking about these tight ends, my man. But in the profile of this Houston offense, I do feel like Dalton Schultz is someone who can't just be overlooked. I know that they want to incorporate, Stephon Diggs, and when Collins comes back, he's going to be reintegrated, and they still have one of the best wide receiver threes in the league in Tank Dell. But my feeling is that in order for there to be more intentionality to what Houston does in obvious passing situations, there needs to be more of a game plan. And Dalton Schultz, against teams, especially in the division like the Colts, who much more predicated on stopping the run than anything else, is going to be someone who can unlock defenses. He's not the biggest, best tight end out there, but he's someone who, in certain situations, can put up meaningful points for you. And this week, there's no better matchup and no better place to do it than a divisional showdown that could really cement them as the team to beat in the AFC South. But let me know what you think about this in the comments, because these tight ends have been really weird to kind of parse throughout the season. But when we come back on the other side, we officially conclude my positional rankings for the week with my defense and special teams units that you have to look out for this week. So we'll be right back to talk about them after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And with our fourth segment of the day here on the show, we officially conclude our positional rankings for the week with our defense and special teams units. Now, these are the units that get most underappreciated in fantasy football, and I know that. But this season, they've really proved to be difference makers. Well, with the shift in the culture of the NFL thus far, where more teams are predicating themselves on defensive prowess, everyone is getting more defensive minded, and the result is these teams that seem very well balanced in terms of their complementary styles of football. And all four of these defenses have proven it thus far. All four of these defenses, when I think about their offenses, they're really just looking for enough points to where they feel like they can lock down certain teams. Because, not for nothing, most of these teams' offenses, you won't say are the biggest juggernauts offensively in the league. These, make no mistake about it, are teams that predicate themselves, much like I said, on their defensive stability. They don't necessarily even have the biggest names either. But they are teams that I do feel like, in certain situations, can rise above their stations. They've done it all season long, and I kind of want to, more than anything, reward these teams more than just make this about matchups and things, because these really are, when you break it down, elite defenses. And so without further ado, let's give them their flowers in this segment. Starting off with a defense that played on Monday night and really wasn't necessarily the reason their team lost, but they are kind of susceptible to the big play, and they don't necessarily have as much depth as, say, other teams on this list. But the Chargers defense going up against the Saints, this one kind of feels like a matchup-oriented one, and just because the Saints don't have a guy like Kyler Murray, who is as mobile as Kyler Murray can be. And so that's one thing that the Chargers won't necessarily have to account for as much. But when I really think about it, the Chargers' defense is just so well-rounded. They're not necessarily overly good at one aspect of stopping opposing offenses. They're very well-balanced. Yes, there's not as much depth as people might think to this defensive roster, but I do like them in this matchup because of the fact that against teams who have limited resources on the offensive side of football, I do feel like the Chargers will have the advantage, and that's why a lot of people like them as a sneaky playoff team. They're not necessarily playing the best teams, and so therefore their defense will only really have to be concerned about, the occasional blip on their schedule where they have to face someone like a Kyler Murray who can be the difference in their respective game, in that respective game. But against the Saints, I'm not really worried about them. They have a pretty easy schedule to pull up the schedule here for them going forward. This week, they do have, like I said, the Saints, but next week, the week after, they have the Browns, the Titans, and they face another pretty tough team in the Bengals and the Ravens. But they don't really have to face that many, thus far, elite quarterbacks who can hurt them. They still will have to, but in this particular matchup, this feels like an easy win for the Chargers defense. sneakily good defense at that. And then the second defense that I want to talk about that really has been a kind of case of quote-unquote no-name talent that really is performing more than the sum of their respective parts, the Broncos defense. And this one is kind of a matchup one, but let's give the Broncos defense their flowers. And kudos to Vance Joseph for truly rejuvenating this unit. Like I said, they don't have the big stars. They have guys on this defense like Jonathan Allen, Riley Moss, Cody Barton, in all three phases of their defense. They can really step up. And they had 21 points last week. And this week they have another easy matchup. And this should be pretty easy sledding going forward for the Broncos. Because much like the Chargers in the AFC West there, they have the Chiefs to worry about in their own division, but if they can stay over 500 and just win the games where they should be favored to win or winnable in their schedule, then, that's half the battle here. They do have a tougher schedule coming up than the Chargers do. After the Panthers, they play the Ravens, the Chiefs, and the Falcons before, getting to the Raiders and the Browns. But at the end of the day, we have to give credit to this spectacular play of this Broncos unit, and it's one that I'm really excited to see develop throughout the season, and if they can potentially be the reason that, say, the Broncos upset one of those teams coming up in that 3-week stretch. Or the third unit that I kind of want to discuss is a unit that's really been keeping their team in games and really has kind of gone under the radar due to the fact that the Texans really haven't been a team that, has truly impressed in any particular one of their wins. They really just, sneak by teams thus far this season. But in terms of their defensive unit, it's one that I'm really excited about in terms of their overall depth and how they can affect certain games. And so, against this Colts offense, where they're overly reliant, on Anthony Richardson being able to make one or two big plays per game, and then, just trying to rely on the run game and trying to develop that as well. The Texans just feel like a unit on the defensive end that now has the resources to overwhelm their divisional opponents. Now, in tougher games like we've seen against, the Packers and the Vikings, they really haven't looked the sum of their parts. But these are the games that I feel like the Texans' defense were meant to be able to take over. And not for nothing, I do feel like now they're becoming the reason the team is winning. They had 11 fantasy points last week. They had 3 sacks, 2 interceptions, and they still lost that game just because of the ineptitude of their offense. So in this game, where the tables might turn and, they could be susceptible to the big play, it's up to them really to determine whether or not they, really can take care of business within this division. I think they can. It's just, in these games, you feel like they're going to win. How does that translate then in the future? And this is the bigger question, to when they're wanting to make a playoff run. It's these games where you have to build that foundation. I think they will do so this week. And the last defense, don't laugh at this last one, because this still is a highly elite defense, regardless of who's playing at quarterback, what the situations on the offensive side of the ball entail. This is still a defense that, no matter what, will always help you in terms of fantasy. This is the Browns defense. And granted, this is a highly, highly, highly tough matchup for them. This is one which, you don't necessarily want to be breaking in a guy on the offensive side of the ball in Jameis Winston, against a Ravens defense that, yes, aren't what they've been like last year, but still have the players to affect this game. But on the defensive side of the football, here's why I feel like the Browns can potentially pull off a defensive masterclass. I feel like when we look at the Browns' defense and the Ravens' offense, the Browns really are one of the best matchups in terms of AFC North teams to go up against this Ravens offense. I feel like the run defense isn't necessarily as well put together as it was last year. They still have a guy like Myles Garrett off the edge who can impact them, and he can line up anywhere. He can project the kick inside sometimes, and they still have, for what it's worth, a guy like Zadarius Smith for however long is going to stay there. He's had trade rumors, but if he stays, he could be someone who can elevate that interior pass rush. But then the real reason why I think the Browns defense can pull this off is their secondary. Their secondary, if you really think about it, matches up so well with the physicality that the Ravens now bring on the offensive side of the football, outside of what they want to do with their run game. Because what I saw in that win over the Bucs was these physical guys, your Andrews, your Batemans, your Likeleys, getting beyond the Bucs linebackers and safeties. But when I look at the Browns secondary, it's a long, rangy group that loves playing in different schemes. They love playing man-to-man, mostly, but even in zone, they're pretty impressive as well. So look for them to really stand up to what the Ravens present to them on the offensive side of the football. They're not necessarily going to be overwhelmed, I feel, in this matchup. No matter what the offensive side of the football does, they could lose by 20, 22 points, let's say. And I still won't feel like, it's the Browns defense that let them down. But who knows? Jameis Winston is a great motivator, not just of his offense, but of his whole team. So maybe we'll see a motivated effort as a result from these Cleveland Browns. But until then, we'll have to see this as a very bold prediction for a defense that could start in your fantasy squad. But that will just about do it for this segment. Coming up next to conclude our show is our college football segment of the day here, previewing from betting perspective some of Week 9's biggest games, starting off with a Friday night matchup that could determine the Group of 5 candidate for the CFP. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back to our final segment of the day on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And Ty, if you are still there, this is finally the segment where we get to talk about the world of college football, one of my most exciting topics to discuss here on the show. In Week 9, not necessarily, the best of games, but there's still some matchups that I really am intrigued by. A lot of big SEC matchups, but perhaps the biggest Notre Dame-Navy game in years in one of the biggest group of 5 games in years. But before we get into that, we do want to address a comment we just got from my man T-Money. It's been quite some time, my friend. How are you talking about his fantasy team? He has Jaden Daniels, Jordan Mason, James Conner, Drake London, Amari Cooper, Sam Laporta, DeAndre Swift, and Kareem Hunt. On his bench, he has Nick Chubb, Brock Purdy, Alexander Mattison, Xavier Worthy, Ladd McConkey. CMC, he's currently 2-5. Oh no. Trade, and he's won in a trade CMC and Mason for K9. And he also just traded DeAndre Swift for Bowers. Oof. I don't know if I completely like that one. In terms of the CMC and Mason for K9 trade, I could see you taking away Christian McCaffrey from this deal and still being able to get it through. I feel like Mason for K9 in a way makes a little more sense just because of the fact you don't know what CMC will look like when he comes back and how big of a role he'll play. Maybe he will live up to the expectations of being the number 1 overall fantasy draft pick in most drafts everywhere. So I wouldn't necessarily immediately jump ship on CMC, but Mason for K9 feels like some move that I could get behind. As for the Swift Bowers one, that one is kind of an interesting one. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the best move, but it's still one, that could work just because, the Raiders no longer have Devontae Adams. There's less pressure to get him the football, and thus more targets will be available. But I still think that Swift was a guy who was just coming into his own in Chicago. So that's why that one leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. But I do like if you subtract CMC from that trade and just doing it like for like Mason for K9, I feel like that can help your team and you will have a pretty deep running back room at your disposal. But hopefully that helps. Good luck to you, my friend, in your fantasy football exploits. But to conclude the show, let's switch to the world of college football for just a second. Like I said, a couple intriguing games. And let's start off in the world of the group of 5, because this could be the game that could determine which group of 5 representative goes to the CFP. It's Boise State, UNLV. A game of drama and a potential Heisman favorite here. It's Ashton Jeanty versus the NIL drama that ensued a couple of weeks ago for UNLV. Boise State is a 2.5-point favorite. The over-under is 65.5. So Vegas believes that the over-under is going to be a high game, and I think it will be a shootout myself. I feel like the UNLV offense hasn't missed a step, whether it's Matthew Sluka at the QB position or Haj Malik Williams, the former Camel leading that offense. But I do feel like the headlines have to go to what Ashton Jeanty can do in another high-profile game for him, because, Heisman moments for a group of 5 teams are few and far between. So Ashton Jeanty, if he really wants to be the presumptive Heisman favorite outright, needs to prove in games of this magnitude that he really is the best player in the country. Because a lot of teams are doubting him. They're saying, he plays in the Mountain West. He only had one big game against Oregon. Yes, he had X amount of yards, but he hasn't played anyone of a national title profile. But in this game, in what could determine whether or not his team makes the playoffs, this could be his Heisman moment. But expect a very group of 5 shootout the OK Corral feel to this game. And also note that no matter what happens, both of these teams are what makes college football so exciting. That being said, I am taking Boise State. But let's talk about another game that could throw a wrench into Boise State's plans to make it into the CFP. Because we have a ranked Navy going up against a ranked Notre Dame in the biggest game in this rivalry in perhaps, I believe, almost like 5 to 6 decades, perhaps. Still, Notre Dame is an 11.5-point favorite. The over-under is 52.5 there. And this is an interesting game because both of these offenses, for some reason, feel so similar. because you have the triple option of Navy, Blake Horvath running it to a T, and then you have Riley Leonard, the transfer from Duke and Notre Dame, also being a pretty interesting dual threat QB. But the question here is Riley Leonard the guy in big games this magnitude? Because a lot of these transfer QBs have been called into question in big games, none other than Will Howard a couple weeks ago against Oregon, and haven't really risen to the occasion. I know that this isn't necessarily the biggest game to date on Notre Dame's schedule, and they already have a quality win, but they can't afford to lose another game to a team they should project to beat, especially considering that first loss was against a Northern Illinois team that, a lot of people were kind of excited about after that win, but really after, 9 weeks of the season have not lived up to that expectation. So, with that being said, I still like Notre Dame just because they are the more respected, well-rounded teams, but I do feel like Riley Leonard can get caught up in the moment because Navy's offense is going to come fast and loose, and you better be prepared to put up a good amount of points in this one because Navy can put up 40, 50 on anyone. And yes, this is Notre Dame, but they now know the stakes. That Boise State UNLV game, yes, everyone's thinking about that as a decider for the Group of 5 playoff spot. But if Navy wins this one, man, you got to think about them. You got to think about both Navy and Army as well. And this game is the litmus test for that statement. That being said, I can't look past Notre Dame. I feel like, as inept as Riley Leonard has looked in some games, he still is someone who brings a dual threat ability that can physically wear down a defense, which is going to be a hugely important factor. Because it's one thing to be a dual threat quarterback who plays a little bit too loose, but it's quite another to be a guy who's physical and when he's on his game can wear you down. And the Navy defense hasn't really faced someone like Riley Leonard this season, so I'm going to take Notre Dame. And the last two matchups I want to get to conclude today's show are two very intriguing SEC matchups. I think only one of these is considered an eliminator in terms of the stakes of this game, but both of them are games in which all four of these teams feel like if they win, they have a chance to contend for the SEC title because it's so wide open. Let's start off with LSU, Texas A&M in College Station. Texas A&M, the 2.5-point favorite, over under 53.5 in this one. And I think when I think about these two teams, I think LSU takes their high moments with their low moments. They had that big win against Ole Miss. Haven't really, looked at some of their parts in some games. Had that early season loss to USC that looks worse and worse by the week. But they're going into College Station with an opportunity to knock off a pretty hot Texas A&M team. Now, the thing I like about Texas A&M is that they seem to have structure when Connor Wegman plays, even though he isn't the more explosive quarterback. I feel like Marcel Reed gets you the big plays more often. But Wegman is someone who I really like as just a stabilizer of this Texas A&M offense, letting Le'Veon Moss run the show at the running back position. So that's why I feel like Texas A&M should be the favorite and will win this game, just because the structure of their offense is a little bit more concrete than what LSU presents. Because LSU, make no mistakes about it, I love Garrett Nussmeier, I love that wide receiver room, but it just feels like it's too reliant on one thing. And then let's switch off to the Missouri-Alabama game to end off this show. This one is the eliminator here, because if Alabama loses, this season is up in flames. If Missouri loses, they're proving that potentially they were not the team we thought they were coming into the season. But Alabama is a 13.5-point favorite. The over-under is 55.5. And I think that this is the game where Alabama gets themselves righted. I feel like Jalen Miller is too explosive for a Missouri defense that has been exposed at certain points throughout the season. And Brady Cook has just not looked himself this season. to really help bolster what is needed on the offensive side of the football for Missouri. That being said, Luther Burden could be a game wrecker in this one. And he is someone who I can't overlook, but I still feel like Alabama will be able to make one or two more explosive plays than Mizzou and take care of business here. But that was just about do it for this. Let me know what you think about the show in the comments. But this has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I have been Christopher Shepard. We'll be back here tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network if you haven't done so already. Continue making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube to interact with the show. It means the world to us here at the network. But other than that, I am out for today.